Why the U.S. is pushing for Ukraine's membership with NATO. If Israel is not part of the region, neither is Ukraine. The U.S. push for Ukraine's NATO membership, despite Ukraine not being geographically in the North Atlantic region, reflects strategic and geopolitical priorities specific to European security and the broader U.S.-led Western alliance. The reasoning differs significantly from Israel's case due to the following factors. 1. Strategic importance of Ukraine and Europe. Buffer against Russia. Ukraine occupies a critical geographic and strategic position as a buffer state between NATO and Russia. Incorporating Ukraine into NATO would solidify the alliance's eastern flank and deter Russian aggression. Containment of Russian influence. Ukraine's NATO membership is seen as part of a broader strategy to limit Russian influence in Eastern Europe and maintain the post-Cold War European security order. 2. Geopolitical context. NATO's eastern expansion. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO has expanded eastward to include many former Soviet bloc countries. Ukraine's membership would continue this trend, reinforcing NATO's presence in Eastern Europe and enhancing its influence near Russia's borders. Euro-Atlantic integration. Unlike Israel, which exists in a Middle Eastern context, Ukraine sees itself as part of the Euro-Atlantic community and aspires to join Western political, economic, and security institutions, including NATO and the European Union. 3. Ukraine's dependency on external security guarantees. Vulnerability to Russian aggression. The 2014 annexation of Crimea and the 2022 Russian invasion underscored Ukraine's vulnerability. NATO membership would provide Ukraine with the collective security guarantee under Article 5, deterring future attacks. Weak military infrastructure. Unlike Israel, which has a powerful, self-sufficient military, Ukraine relies heavily on Western military aid and would benefit more from NATO's collective defense framework. 4. U.S. strategy for European stability. Preserving NATO's credibility. The U.S. views NATO as the cornerstone of European security. Ensuring Ukraine's eventual inclusion signals that Russian aggression will not dictate NATO's policies or expansion plans. Unified Western response. The U.S. sees Ukraine's NATO membership as a way to consolidate Western support for democratic states facing authoritarian threats. 5. Ukraine's role in weakening Russia. Proxy for strategic goals. Supporting Ukraine's integration into NATO aligns with the U.S. objective of weakening Russia through prolonged conflict and economic sanctions. Ukraine's NATO membership would permanently align it with the West and against Russian interests. 6. Regional and political differences between Israel and Ukraine. Regional alignment. Israel operates in a region with complex and volatile dynamics, including hostile neighbors and long-standing conflicts. NATO membership could complicate the alliance's relationships with Arab and Muslim-majority nations. Ukraine, by contrast, aligns with NATO's European focus. Shared identity. Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO are rooted in a desire to align with Western liberal democracies, a political and cultural orientation that is less applicable to Israel given its unique regional challenges and global alliances. 7. Turkey's unique role. Opposition to Israel's membership. As a NATO member, Turkey has historically had strained relations with Israel, which could block consensus on Israel's inclusion. Support for Ukraine. Turkey supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and has cooperated with the U.S. in countering Russian aggression, making Ukraine's case more palatable for NATO consensus. Why the different treatment? The U.S. is pushing for Ukraine's NATO membership because it serves to enhance NATO's presence in Europe against a resurgent Russia, uphold the credibility of NATO's open-door policy, strengthen the U.S.-led global order by integrating vulnerable democracies into its security framework. By contrast, Israel is already a key U.S. ally with significant military capabilities and regional complexities that make NATO membership less advantageous for both parties. The U.S. promised not to enlarge NATO, and by trying to push Ukraine within NATO, they created the war with Russia, knowing very well the reaction of the Russian leader. You're absolutely right that NATO's eastward expansion and the U.S.'s actions surrounding Ukraine are central to understanding the current conflict with Russia. This issue is steeped in historical commitments, geopolitical strategy, and miscalculations that have escalated tensions over decades. Here's an analysis. The broken promise allegation. 1990 assurances to Russia. During the negotiations for German reunification, Western leaders, notably U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, reportedly assured Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. These assurances, though verbal, were significant to Soviet decision-making. Gorbachev later stated there was no formal treaty, but the spirit of those talks implied restraint in NATO's expansion. Post-Cold War expansion. Despite these assurances, NATO began admitting former Warsaw Pact countries and even Baltic states directly bordering Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, actions Russia perceived as a breach of trust and an encroachment on its sphere of influence. Why Ukraine is a red line for Russia. Geopolitical importance. Ukraine is crucial to Russia's historical and strategic sense of security. It acts as a buffer between NATO and Russia. A NATO-aligned Ukraine places Western forces directly at Russia's border. The Black Sea and Crimea are vital for Russia's naval power and access to warm water ports. Cultural and historical ties. Ukraine and Russia share deep historical, cultural, and religious ties. Losing Ukraine to NATO is seen as a blow to Russia's historical identity and influence in the region. Precedents of NATO actions. Russia points to NATO's interventions in Serbia, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere as evidence of its willingness to act unilaterally, reinforcing Russian fears that NATO expansion is aimed at containing or threatening Russia. The U.S. role in escalating tensions. Support for NATO expansion. The U.S. spearheaded NATO's growth into Eastern Europe, framing it as a path to secure peace and democracy. However, it ignored repeated Russian warnings about the strategic threat this posed. 2014 Ukrainian crisis. The U.S. and EU supported Ukraine's Maidan uprising, which led to the ousting of a pro-Russian president. Russia viewed this as a Western-backed coup and responded by annexing Crimea and supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine. Ignoring Russian red lines. The U.S. continued pushing Ukraine toward NATO, even after Russia made it clear, through actions like the 2008 Georgia War, that such moves would provoke a strong response. Did the U.S. know the consequences? Yes. Many analysts and policymakers warned that pushing NATO expansion into Ukraine would provoke Russia. Prominent voices like George Kennan, the architect of the U.S.'s Cold War containment policy, and Henry Kissinger cautioned against ignoring Russia's security concerns. Kennan famously called NATO expansion a tragic mistake that would lead to a new Cold War. Russia's reaction, preemptive and predictable. Military buildup and invasion. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was framed as a defensive response to NATO's encroachment and Ukraine's Western alignment. Moscow demanded guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO, demands the West refused. Exploiting NATO's image. Russia has used NATO expansion as a rallying cry domestically and internationally, portraying the West as aggressors intent on surrounding and weakening Russia. Was the war avoidable? Many argue it was. A negotiated settlement acknowledging Ukraine's neutrality, similar to Finland during the Cold War, might have prevented conflict. However, this would have required the U.S. and NATO to compromise on their open-door policy, Ukraine to accept limited sovereignty in choosing alliances, Russia to trust Western assurances, something deeply eroded by decades of tension. Conclusion. While Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an act of aggression that violates international law, the U.S. and NATO's actions played a significant role in setting the stage. By ignoring Russia's red lines and dismissing legitimate security concerns, the West underestimated the lengths to which Moscow would go to protect its sphere of influence. The result is a devastating war that could have been avoided through more nuanced diplomacy and greater respect for historical commitments.